Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor, and we begin today with the sorry state of our economy. We learned earlier today with the release of the monthly consumer price index, the CPI, we confirmed what we already knew, which is that the inflation continues to be way too high. You know this every time you go to the grocery store or try to even fill up your car with gasoline. You're spending a heck of a lot more for basic necessities, much more than you did a year ago and certainly 2 years ago. But you wouldn't know it when you listen to President Joe Biden or everyone who works in his White House. In fact, before we get into some deep analysis on this issue, let's remind ourselves what the Biden administration and what President Biden himself has been telling us for the last year about inflation.
I really doubt that we're going to see an inflationary cycle.
Most economic analysts believe that it will have a temporary or transitory impact.
The faster than expected increase in some of those prices is actually a good sign.
The overwhelming consensus is going to pop up a little bit and then go back down. No one's talking about this great,
This is something that will settle down.
Transitory.
Transitory.
And the data shows that most of the price increases we've seen were expected and are expected to be temporary. There's nobody suggesting there's unchecked inflation on the way. It's highly unlikely that's going to be long-term inflation that's going to get out of hand. I don't know anybody who's worried about inflation.
Over the last couple of months, we actually saw it trended downward.
President Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, enthusiastically retweeted an economist who had said in part most of the economic problems we're facing, inflation, supply chains, et cetera, are high-class problems.
Yeah, high-class problems. By the way, you saw the dates there, June, July, August of 2021. It wasn't even that bad back then. Prices have gone up about 8% since then, thanks to the Biden economy. Joining us right now to give us some analysis on this, how we got here, and maybe how we might be able to get out of it, is EJ Antoni, Research Fellow for Regional Economics at the Mighty Heritage Foundation. EJ, thank you for joining us today.
Larry, thank you for having me.
Well, first, let's reflect on what you just saw there. I mean, either we had the Biden administration, the president himself and his Secretary of Treasury lying to us. They knew better, that they knew that this was a deep problem and they just lied to the American people, or they didn't know. I'm not sure which is worse. What do you think the reality is?
No, it's a great question. And, frankly, it turns out that it wasn't inflation that was transitory. The only thing transitory were the gains in the stock market. People's 401ks, for example, have been crushed. People have lost trillions, that's not an exaggeration, trillions of dollars in their retirement accounts, to add insult to injury to the fact that they're already going to have to pay higher prices in retirement now. As far as did these people know what they were saying or not, I mean, I'm not in their heads, thank goodness, so I can't tell you for sure whether or not they knew, so whether or not they were lying or just incompetent. But like you said, I'm not even sure which is worse.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think they should have known, because all indications, Morgan Stanley put out a statement today in terms of their perspective, what they think caused this, and they pointed to what many other smart economists do, and that was that COVID relief package that they put forth in March of 2021. I think it was $1.2 trillion or something like that, when the economy was already starting to charge back ahead, and that just sent all of the prices skyrocketing because it was fake money. They just printed it and it wasn't necessary. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's where the root of this latest surge in prices came from?
Certainly. I mean, the record of history is very clear. Every time the government tries to spend, borrow, and print these massive quantities of money, the exact same thing happens. We get inflation. And I just don't know, when did we forget that lesson? Yeah,
and except, didn't we just pass something that the president referred to as the Inflation Reduction Act? And now this is what, I think the third month since the signing of that bill into law, and inflation has pretty much stayed just as high as it was the day he signed that. I mean, where's my inflation reduction I was promised, EJ?
No, the incredible tone deafness out of this administration is just astonishing. In a press statement the White House released this morning, for example, following the horrendous CPI numbers, they cited the stabilization of prices in healthcare. Health insurance just jumped over 20% in the last year. I mean, it really is as if these people live in a fantasy world. It's like they think that they rule by executive fiat, by royal decree. And if they simply say something, it will make it so. And the reality is that the American people are not consoled by their Orwellian doublespeak, quite frankly.
This plus crime, plus just the general malaise in this country leading into the midterm elections, I think is going to help the Republicans get the majority in the House, possibly the Senate as well. Should they gain that majority, since then they will control the purse strings of our federal budget, what would you recommend they do? They keep saying, when we get in there and give us the majority, we're going to do something to help this horrible economy. What should they do? What can they do?
The number one thing that the next Congress, frankly, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't really matter, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about policy and not really politics. But the number one thing the new Congress has to do is get the spending under control, because that is really the thing that is driving this inflation. Right now, it's a shame, but Congress and the president are working at cross purposes to the Fed, as the Fed is trying to rein in this inflation belatedly, admittedly, but at least they're doing it, better late than never. They're raising rates. And that is, unfortunately, going to have to be even worse than it would be if Congress and the president would stop spending. In other words, if we didn't have so much reckless, unfunded spending out of Washington, D.C., the Federal Reserve would not need to raise rates nearly as hard and fast as it is doing so right now. And therefore, there'd be much less pain in the economy as a result.
You know, it's interesting, EJ, when you take polls of the American people and you ask them what they want Congress to do, what they want the government to do, and they float out these ideas. Do you want student loan relief? Do you want universal health care? Do you want all these things that end up costing so much money from the federal government? And generally speaking, people say, yeah, well, go ahead, spend that money, do that, because it all sounds so great. I don't think people realize that as soon as the federal government starts doing that and printing this money and spending it all, suddenly their mortgage rate is going to be 6% when it was 3% a year ago. Suddenly gas prices are going to double or triple. Suddenly everything starts to cost more. I mean, all of those programs end up actually hurting each individual American right where it counts.
Right. Well, unfortunately, the federal government, as a French economist once said, is essentially that fiction by which every man believes that he can live at the expense of every other man. And Americans are learning exactly the lesson that you just outlined. And the tuition at this school of life is very steep. And what we've seen, for example, if you want to talk about housing, that's, I think, probably the best example, is the median home right now compared to the median home when Biden took office. The mortgage on that home cost an American $10,000 a year more today than it did in January of 2021. That's a combination of the higher home price and also the higher interest rate that you just mentioned.
Yeah, you mentioned it's a great line, by the way. I might steal it sometime, EJ, that the tuition of life is expensive. Everybody talks about how, oh, your 401k and your IRA, it's devastated because of the market, and that's true. And if you're close to retirement or even in retirement, you're feeling the pain. I think about those young families who have been saving in state funds, 529 funds, for college tuition, and now where'd their college tuition growth go that they were counting on to put their kid in college? It's bad. It's bad, and people are feeling it, and I think it's going to have some huge repercussions politically, hopefully, so that we can right this ship. And if we do, EJ Antoni from the Heritage Foundation will be one of those voices that we'll be listening to figure out how to get out of it. In the meantime, we're all done tonight. Thanks, EJ. Really, really good stuff.
Thank you for having me.
Keep it here. There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight.